For millions of years, the main drivers of dopamine were hunting for food, reproducing, and finding shelter. So when we were strictly living to hunt for our next meal and didn't have smartphones, processed food, or video games, the drive to do what felt good was actually a massive advantage. And at the very base of this core need to survive is food, sitting at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is exactly why food has the deepest dopamine pathway of anything that you do. But the real turning point happened roughly 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, where for the first time in human history, we had seemingly unlimited access to food outside of its natural context. And this was accelerated even further just a couple hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution, which processed and concentrated these foods even further, making them more accessible and more stimulating than anything our biology ever would have encountered. So most dopamine detoxes are fighting battles at the very top of the pyramid while leaving the foundation completely untouched. And even the ones that do address food still miss the real nuance. Because what if one of the most addictive substances in your diet isn't junk food, but something hiding in plain sight that is even more addictive than cocaine? Most people, when cleaning up their diet, still keep in plants, which all contain carbohydrates. And given that all carbohydrates break down into glucose or sugar in the body, unless you are doing a strict carnivore diet, you are never really cutting out sugar. At a neurochemical level, sugar consumption can downregulate dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 receptors, which are critical for self-control and motivation. Meaning over time, you need more stimulation just to feel the same level of satisfaction. But although sugar can downregulate these receptors, the real issue seems to be just how addicting it is. Although this study was done in rats, it still paints a clear picture as to what is happening. The study found that in rats, sugar was even more addictive than cocaine. In fact, 94% of the rats chose the sweet taste of sugar over cocaine, even when they were already drug sensitized or addicted. And given that we share near identical reward pathways, it is hard to dismiss what this implies. Now you might think this only applies to junk food, but this is actually where it gets a little more sneaky. When you eat whole foods that contain carbohydrates, you don't get the big spike, but you can get a slow drip over time. From an evolutionary perspective, for most of our history, sugar was extremely scarce or outright non-existent depending on the geography and ice age conditions. When it did appear, ripe fruit or honey, it made perfect sense to binge on it. But fructose specifically, often found in fruit, never fully suppressed hunger the way a real meal did. It was essentially a biological signal to keep pursuing real food, like meat, rather than a satisfying endpoint, meaning that it can actually stimulate more hunger, and we more so saw it as a safe quick hit of energy during times of starvation. Not to mention that modern fruit has been selectively bred to be as sweet as possible. A wild fruit from tens of thousands of years ago may have been no sweeter than a carrot. What we call whole food fruit today is likely closer to candy. And the problem here is that there was never a strong enough negative selection pressure to turn off that mechanism. Our brains are still wired to prioritize sugar the moment we get a taste of it. So as long as carbohydrates are present in the diet, that wiring can stay active. Now it's worth clarifying something first. Willpower isn't really a scientific term. When I mean willpower, it is essentially two things: decision fatigue multiplied by urges and emotions. And the carnivore diet works remarkably well for both. The carnivore diet strips your choices down to only animal products. In its simplest form, you're really just prioritizing fatty meat from large ruminant animals. So this sheer reduction in food-related decisions alone removes an enormous drain on the mental resource you're trying to protect during a detox. And the second variable is where it gets a little more interesting. Urges are essentially a reflection of what inputs your body has come to expect. No matter how clean your diet looks on paper, if carbohydrates are still present in any meaningful amount, that slow drip of sugar is still running in the background. Your capacity to resist everything else, your phone, your bad habits, your compulsions, is still being quietly depleted before you even begin. So by eliminating plants entirely, you cut off that drip completely. And what most people find is that once food is handled, the other battles become significantly easier without any additional effort. But there is one important nuance here. Cutting sugar out completely and suddenly can actually cause urges to come back even stronger than before. After all, coming off carbohydrates or sugar can cause real withdrawal symptoms, which is why transitioning into carnivore properly, giving your metabolism, hormones, and gut microbiome time to adjust, matters more than people realize. A dopamine detox is typically treated as a speed run, a short-term reset before going back to normal life. But if your normal life is what created the problem in the first place, what exactly are you resetting back to? A common misconception about the carnivore diet is that it is only good for fat loss, but I actually think these psychological benefits are some of the most powerful. In 2021, Harvard surveyed over 2,000 people on the carnivore diet, and aside from the typical health improvements, the biggest reported changes were in mental clarity, focus, and reduced food cravings. After all, once you cut out carbohydrates, your body's entire metabolic state shifts. Instead of relying on glucose, it can now rely on ketones, which are a far more stable and efficient source of energy for your brain. Not to mention, it can even downregulate certain inflammatory pathways that are often associated with brain fog. But beyond just fuel, ketones, specifically BHB or beta-hydroxybutyrate, can act more like a signaling molecule than a simple energy source. This ketone can directly trigger the release of BDNF, which is essentially a miracle grow for the brain, helping repair the neurons in your reward circuitry. BHB also helps restore the balance between glutamate and GABA, the brain's excitatory and calming chemicals, which is why people in carnivore often describe a sense of calm clarity rather than anxious, restless energy that comes with a high carbohydrate diet. But aside from all of this, there is something that the carnivore diet does by default that can affect the other areas of your life. Your identity or self-image is not a fixed construct. The choices you make every single day either reinforce the person you want to become or the person that you don't want to be. And given that food sits at the very base of our needs, it becomes one of the most powerful reinforcing choices that you can make multiple times every single day. The same biological state that makes you reach for junk food is the same state that makes you reach for your phone, skip the gym, or take the path of least resistance everywhere else. Whereas the flip side can be equally true. Each time you eat the right thing, you're not just giving your body the proper nutrients it needs to function properly, but you are casting a vote for the identity of someone who does the right thing, and this can compound over time, whether it's for good or bad. There is a common saying that the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. This is essentially what Maxwell Maltz was pointing to in his book Psycho-Cybernetics, that your behavior will always stay consistent with your self-image and vice versa. And there is arguably no more powerful way to change that image than by mastering something you do multiple times per day that has a direct effect on how your biology actually functions and sits at the very base of your needs. And if you want help actually implementing this properly, including a 60-day carnivore guide and my 7 principles to optimize your biology, you can get direct access to me and the full Stoium Reset Protocol, which is a 14-day step-by-step system that I originally built for myself that applies all of the principles in practice. So if you want to check that out, the link is in the description below.